Are you an adventurer looking to take your hunt to the next level? Then you're in the right place. Welcome to East Meets West Hunt with your host, Bo Martonic.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the East Meets West Hunt podcast presented by Onyx. So the Onyx Hunt app is basically a hunting GPS map that's made for hunters by hunters, where there's 985 million acres of public land, over 400 map overlays, and just keeps continuing, over 9,000 unique hunting units, and a whole bunch of other stuff, including being able to track and record your trip, being able to look at your private public land boundaries, aerial imagery with 24K topos, be able to use the maps offline, and also use custom waypoints to be able to mark some of your key areas from home or on your phone. So if you want to check out the Hunt app, you can head over to onyxmaps.com. And if you use the coupon code EMW, that'll save yourself 20% off of both the premium and elite memberships. So check that out at onyxmaps.com. And Maven Optics. So Maven was born out of wanting to solve a problem, out of the idea that they can develop a product with no compromise in quality and no compromise in performance without the big box store markup. So that's kind of the business model they took with their direct-to-consumer model. And one of the cool things Maven's able to do with this is be able to allow you to build complete custom optics for you. You can change everything from the frames, the bodies, any of the components to different colors, camouflage patterns, whatever that might be. And on top of already getting with the highest quality glass and internal products. So if you head over to mavenbuilt.com, you can go on their build app there and build up your dream optics, see if you're interested in it. And if you are, on any full price optics orders, use the coupon code EastMeetsWest-gift and you get yourself a free gift with any of those optics orders. And the University of Elk Hunting. So Corey Jacobson, Elk 101, have put together the most comprehensive and complete resource for increasing your elk hunting knowledge, your confidence, and success. So in addition to just having full access to this entire course for 1 year, you'll have access to the University of Elk Hunting mobile app, which puts all that same content that you get from the online course right in the palm of your hand, anytime, anywhere, with or without internet or cellular connection. So it's really cool, especially if it's your first time out west and you get a bull on the ground and you're like, well, I don't know what to do to be able to cut this thing up. I forget I watch the videos on quartering them, but I forget. You can watch those videos, download them ahead of time, and be able to check that out. Plus, any UEH members receive incredible discounts from any of the Elk 101 partners, and including 15% off elk hunting gear in the Elk 101 store. So a whole lot of stuff that you'd normally get for $99 a year. If you use the coupon code EastMeetsWest, you can get that for $79. And the knowledge within that course is something that I've been taking in for the last 4 years, and has been a very big help in my own learning curve to be able to be successful out west. So check that out, elk101.com, and click on the University of Elk Hunting, the online course. Check that out. And so I guess from the standpoint of some news that I have here, the Elk Hunting Film from my September elk hunt in Idaho is going to release here shortly. I would assume probably here in the next couple of weeks. It's going to be coming out. I did just release a little teaser video online. This is a short 1 minute video on my YouTube. So if you want to head over to my YouTube channel, is just Bo Martonic, and you check it out. The video is called Appreciation, and it's a little bit of a teaser for the film that will be called Synergy, and that'll be released, like I said, later this month. So super pumped. Justin Mueller, who did all the photos and video work on this trip, he did an excellent job on this film. I'm really excited to release that and be able to have everyone take a look at it. As far as other news here, so I kind of wanted to share something that I learned this past year from hunting a new area in the mountains, so in Pennsylvania here. So I'd found this point of this ridge that was, overlooking a big river bottom, and up on this ridge there was some like a pine thicket, some hemlock trees, and everything else, and a little opening. And on the edge of that opening, on the edge of the thick pines, I'd found some beds with rubs leading out in every direction. And so I kind of assumed that it was buck bedding. And I set a camera up there in April and never went back to it until November. And what I learned, I put the camera on, there was a scrape there. So I put it towards the scrape, but it was kind of overlooking this brushy field on the edge of the pine thicket. And I picked up so many bucks of all age structures, from, year and a half year olds all the way up to some really old deer, using this all through velvet with no food out in front of it. And so all through velvet into early season daylight photos. I mean, a lot of daylight photos, and all the way through till I just checked the camera again here a couple weeks ago, and even had some during rifle season in daylight. I mean, this spot is just overlooked. It's a pretty good walk to get there. For, I don't know, close to 2 miles, something like that, out on this point. And it's a bomb spot. It's extremely tough to hunt with the wind. I tried hunting it one day and I blew a buck out, and I hunted right over the beds. And just the way that the wind worked in that spot, I should have started back a little bit. But anyway, so for late season strategy, I realized there were still some acorns on this ridge about 200 to 300 yards away from this bedding point. So I went back in and scouted it a couple weeks ago, and when there was snow, I found some fresh beds. Looked like a lot of doe beds, maybe one buck bed that was over the hill a little bit, and saw where they were coming up and feeding. So I went in this past Saturday, which was the only day I've been able to hunt so far in the late season, and I took my saddle in. I climbed up on this big boulder and then climbed up into an oak tree, looking at, I was kind of on the first bench down over the side of the hill, and as it funneled out to this, this little knob basically where there was some acorns on the ground, and I saw 12 deer. No bucks. They were all does that I could tell. I don't think any of them were bucks that had lost their antlers already, but it was just really interesting to be able to learn that. Not every point's like that, not every spot, and it's really tough to be able to explain, to say, okay, every feature that looks like this is going to be this way, because that's not the case. And that's where trail cameras can help you out, and just boots on the ground scouting in the spring is just huge for being able to check that out. But I do plan on I think on New Year's Day here, we're getting a cold front in. Got to see what the dominant wind's going to be, to see kind of how they're going to bed on this point, and go in again and see if any of the bucks get up moving with the cold weather coming in. So that's kind of my plan here going forward in late season. Only a few more days that I'm able to hunt, but really looking forward to that. So in regards to all of this and Pennsylvania and the rest of the Appalachian region here, one of the places I've learned a lot of information over the years is through the Penn State Deer-Forest Study. And so I brought Dwayne Dieffenbach on the podcast here today to be able to talk about that study and some of the findings they found with it. Really interesting stuff. I mean, this podcast, it gets in a lot of detail, but just scratches the surface to some of their studies with collaring deer, and there's a lot of free information out there to be able to learn about it. I do apologize that there is a sound quality issue on this episode. I Must have been some sort of a bad connection between Dwayne and I don't like putting out podcasts that don't have the best quality. I apologize for that, but there's so much good information in here. I wanted to make sure that I got it out there. So please forgive me on that. Don't get mad. Don't be sending me hateful messages. If you do, then whatever. Probably deserve it for something else. So, but anyways, I guess here it's, New Year's Eve, and I want to wish everyone a happy new year, and, just good luck with everything. Hopefully you spent the holidays, with your families and friends and everything else here. And it's another year to, chase your dreams and do whatever makes you happy. So I guess we'll jump on this episode here with Dwayne Diefenbach. All right, welcome back to another episode of the East Meets West Hunt podcast. And tonight I'm joined on the line by Dwayne Dieffenbach. Dwayne, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on and finally get to talk to you here. You've been on my list of people I've been wanting to talk to for a while, and I had someone that put us in contact, so I'm extremely excited about that, to get to talk to you a little bit.
Well, like I said, I'm glad to be here. It should be fun.
Yeah, for sure. So, Dwayne, to get started here, would you mind giving a little bit of a background of yourself, what you do for work, and kind of the reason that I'm having you on here?
Okay. Well, I'm the leader of the Pennsylvania Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at Penn State. I'm actually an employee of the U.S. Geological Survey, and it sounds kind of strange, but the co-op units, they're associated, there's 40 of them across the country, and they're associated with the major land-grant institutions, universities in each state, and they're a cooperative in which the U.S. Geological Survey provides employees, usually about 3 scientists, and the university, of course, provides office space and administrative support, and the State Wildlife Agency provides research support. And so my job, and I guess I should back up before me, the co-op unit at Penn State has been there since 1938, and the job of co-op unit scientists is to primarily work with the State Wildlife Agency, or in Pennsylvania we have the Fish and Boat Commission as well, to collaborate with them on wildlife research problems. And I started in my job there at Penn State in 1999, and in 2000 we started some research on fawn survival, and that's just progressed into a series of increasingly complex projects over the last 20 years studying white-tailed deer. And so that's how I got where I am today.
Okay. And so I've been, I guess, a student from the side of the reading your studies now for quite a few years. I'd say maybe 2014, 15, somewhere in that range. Does that sound correct? When did you start the Deer-Forest Study?
Yeah, actually it started in 2013, late 2013, really didn't get rolling until 2014.
Okay. That makes sense, and it's something that I've been extremely interested in reading, especially coming from I'm from north central Pennsylvania, northwestern PA here, and growing up you don't read a whole lot about how these deer act and live within the forest that we have here. It's not your typical, when you think of whitetail hunting and what you see in the media and stuff, you think of the Midwest and farm country and everything. So that was, increasingly interesting to me to be able to read some of these studies, and it really helped, me as a hunter throughout the years. So if you could talk a little bit about the study and, kind of what your goals and stuff for that is.
Sure. So the current study, we call it the Deer-Forest Study. I guess because that rolls off the tongue better, but really it should be the Forest Deer Study, because really we're a little more interested in understanding forests and several factors that influence forest vegetation conditions. Of course, one of those factors are deer, and actually there's a whole host of factors. I mean, we could talk about insects, soils, precipitation, acid deposition, diseases, insect outbreaks. There's so many things that affect our forests, but we don't have unlimited funds, and when we started the project, we said, well, we need to identify 2 or 3 key factors that we think are influencing our forests, and of course, deer is one of the important ones. And we also decided to look at soil conditions and also competing vegetation, and by that I mean vegetation like mountain laurel or fern, that if they become super abundant, they can potentially impede the growth of other types of vegetations like tree seedlings or forest herbs and other things like that. So again, the objective here is really to look at the interaction of soils, deer browse, and competing vegetation and how those 3 factors influence our forests. There's been a lot of research over the years, and we know that when you have a lot of deer, they can eat a lot of vegetation and have an impact. We also know that soils are important, and we also know that competing vegetation is important. But what we really needed to do was look at how those 3 factors interact. So, for example, if you have really poor soil conditions, what kind of do deer have a greater impact under those conditions than if we have good soil conditions? So, I'm getting a little down into the weeds here, no pun intended. Really, like I said, the study is really about the forests, but in order to study those conditions, we need to study deer, and as a result, we've learned a whole lot about deer that I think has been really fascinating and interesting to especially deer hunters, because of some of the new technology that we have available to us that we really didn't even have 10 years ago.
Okay, and so within that, when you started, studying the deer and their correlation to the forest, what were some of the things that you started looking at? I guess first, let me back up and say, what areas are you looking at? Can you kind of describe the areas that you're doing this research at?
Yeah, so one of the things that's a little bit different about this study, actually I would say it's rather groundbreaking, is that we have 4 study areas. Each of those studies is probably, well, I can tell you, is 25 to 40 square miles. So they're really large. They're on our state forest lands. So they're essentially contiguous tracts of forest. And we have 2 study areas up in north central Pennsylvania in Potter County on the Susquehannock State Forest. And we have 2 other study areas in central Pennsylvania, just south of State College, where Penn State University is located, on the Rothrock Forest and Bald Eagle State Forest. And so what we're trying to do is, at a large scale, manipulate deer populations through deer hunt and monitor changes in vegetation in response to those changes in deer density. And so there's a host of factors. The research is supported by both the Game Commission and the Bureau of Forestry, because both agencies are very interested in in the objectives that we have for this project, like I described earlier.
Okay. So what were some of the techniques that you're using to study the deer, and how they were interacting to meet your objectives there?
Right. So on the deer side of things, we're capturing deer, and we fit them with these satellite GPS collars. And so this technology really has come a long way because of cell phones. And basically, we've got better electronics, and that can be powered by smaller batteries. And so basically, these radio collars are essentially a GPS unit that hangs around the neck of the deer, and then that GPS unit can collect data however we program it and transmit the locations of the animal via satellite to our computers, to my desktop. And in fact, we can communicate with those collars. We can tell them start collecting a location every half hour or even every 10 minutes if we wanted to. Essentially, with the fixes that we get in the course of a year, we might get about 2,000 to 3,000 locations on a given deer, and collars can last about 3 years.
Okay.
So with those collars, we get intensive information on their movements that really wasn't available to us 10 years ago. And we almost get it in real time because the satellite transmits those locations to us. On the vegetation side of things, we have hundreds of permanent plots spread out through the state forest where we're measuring vegetation conditions, primarily understory vegetation, such as tree seedlings and a variety of herbaceous species that deer, in particular the ones that deer like to eat. A lot of plants from the lily family are, in fact, in the springtime when a female is getting ready to give birth or lactating, those herbs can represent 90% of a deer's diet. So they're really important to deer. So we're trying to understand how deer affect those plants.
Okay. And so through some of those studies and everything, what were some of the interesting things that you've learned through that, or what as far as between the correlation with the deer and also the vegetation in those different areas?
Well, so when you look at that interaction between deer and vegetation and soils, in fact, it's the reason why this project was started in 2013 and is still going on, because we need a lot of time. Deer cycle on an annual basis, and a generation might be 7 to 10 years. But when you talk about a generation of a forest, you're talking like 80 years. So this really needs to be a long-term study, and we're just beginning to see some changes in our vegetation in response to some of the manipulations we're trying to do. But regardless, we have found some interesting things, and I guess I'll first start out with some of the deer work. Is really it's sort of peripheral to the project, but it's been interesting, especially if you're a deer hunter, to see some of the movements of these deer during the rut. These bucks go from maybe moving about 20 to 25 miles over the course of a month to over 100 miles just during that 4 weeks of the key rut period. We also, the response, a lot of people have known that everyone who's hunted deer in Pennsylvania knows that during the rifle season, they just seem to disappear. And some of our research has provided some insights into that. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. On the vegetation side of things, we really don't know a lot about some of these important herbaceous plants that deer eat in the springtime. You know, as I mentioned, things like Canada mayflower is a small lily. It's more abundant in northern Pennsylvania in our northern hardwood stands. You know, as I mentioned, that might represent 90% of their diet might be consumed by types of plants in the springtime. And what we found is that that soil conditions play a big part in these plants. In fact, it may be as important or more important than deer at this point. We know over the past 30 years that the pH of our soils has declined in Pennsylvania, on average about a unit of pH. So a pH value of 7 is neutral, less than 7 is acidic, and greater than 7 is, of course, alkaline or basic. And once you get below about 5.3 pH, plants are, once you get down to about in the 5, some plants are being affected by aluminum toxicity because in our soils, usually when you're above a pH of 5.5 or 6, the major nutrients that cycle are things like calcium and magnesium and phosphorus, which everyone, you know, who's ever gardened or been a farmer knows that that's really important to growing plants. And then once you drop down below about 5.3 or 5.5, there's no more calcium in the soil to cycle. And so other things start to cycle, like, and usually metals like aluminum or manganese, and those metals are toxic to plants. And so what we found on our study area is that almost all the pHs of the soil samples collected are below 5.3, which means practically all the plants are suffering some level of aluminum toxicity. And that means bad things for both plants and deer, because as I mentioned, you know, they're not independent one another. The deer depend on the plants to, you know, reproduce and grow. And if the plants can't grow that well, that means that the forest can support fewer deer. So what we're seeing is real evidence of impairment of our forests and ability to support white-tailed deer because of acid deposition over the past, you know, 100, 150 years.
Okay, and what causes that acid deposition?
Well, it's from our burning of fossil fuels primarily. That creates sulfates and nitrates that get taken up into the atmosphere. That interacts with the sun to create sulfuric and nitric acids that come down in the rain. And those acids basically are leaching the calcium and the magnesium and the phosphorus from our forest soils. Now, granted, air conditions and acid deposition is a lot less than it was even 10 or 15 years ago, but that damage has been done. And, you know, we're going to be living with that problem for decades in the future.
Okay. One question I have, and maybe you'll be able to kind of help me connect the dots here, is I remember when I was younger and even before I started hunting, when deer numbers in this part of the state and in northern Pennsylvania seemed to be a lot higher, and there was a lot more deer, but there were smaller deer, it seemed like, from a body size standpoint, and that what we're seeing now is a lot bigger, healthier deer, but lower deer numbers. Does that have to do with that correlation there?
A little bit, and it's part of the motivation for me to do this research. If I've told people before that if you had asked me when I started doing deer research at the turn of the last century, in 2000, what's the major problem facing our forests, I would have said too many deer and the inability of our forests to support the number of deer that we have. But in the early 2000s, when the Game Commission implemented antler point restrictions and increased antlerless deer, we reduced the population in Pennsylvania on average by about 23%. And so we've reduced deer numbers, and so today deer browsing is not the major problem from our forests. And the question for me is, but we still have problems in our forests, and foresters have problems regenerating, forests after they harvest timber. The question is, do we need fewer deer still, or are there some other issues out there? Is there some interaction effects? And so, again, that's getting back to the motivation for this research.
Okay.
Deer, there are fewer deer in Pennsylvania than there were 20 years ago. That was intentional. And now the question, that we're coming back to is how we're trying to fine-tune our ability to understand how many deer should be out there and what are some of the factors that are limiting our ability to manage deer.
Okay. So, within, some of you'd mentioned something about the antler restrictions that were, implemented, and I know that's a little bit of a different topic there, but I've read where you've talked about that a little bit. Do you want to kind of give some of your thoughts on the antler restrictions and what that's done?
Well, antler point restrictions, when they were implemented in Pennsylvania, the objective was to reduce the harvest rate on 1.5-year-old bucks and from about 80% down to 50%. And so that those bucks would then be alive, as 2.5-year-olds. And the difference in antler size from a 1.5 to a 2.5-year-old deer can be huge. And so the antler point restrictions in Pennsylvania, if you're in Pennsylvania, you know that in some parts of the state it's 4 points on a side, and in other parts of the state it's 3 points. And that just relates to general quality of soil conditions. You get into western PA, on the Ohio border, those counties have better soils. 50% of the yearling bucks have at least 4 points, so hence the 4-point rule. And whereas in most of the rest of Pennsylvania, 50% of yearling bucks have, 3 points, at least 3 points on one side. So biologically, the regulations that were implemented worked. We reduced the harvest rate on yearling bucks. 90% of bucks that survive the hunting season are alive as 2.5-year-olds. And we also know from our research that about 60% of hunters support antler point restrictions. So from the standpoint of a biological management action, they're successful. And from the social side, they're also successful because a majority of hunters support them.
Yeah, I mean, and again, this is just from what I've seen from non-scientific side of the equation here, is just the size of the deer and the age of the deer have definitely, increased. When I was younger, you didn't see, deer that were 3.5 years or older, that would be harvested, that were people were getting, during the seasons. And this past archery season, Dwayne, my and just in my immediate family, there was one deer that my uncle had shot that we're assuming we have to get the actual results on that, but is about 8 years old based off of sheds and trail camera photos, and 3 others that were at least 5 years old. And that did not happen, even 20 years ago. And just
no, before APRs, I mean, a 4.5-year-old deer, probably less than 1% of them. Now you're talking probably 10% of the deer in Pennsylvania are 4.5 years old of the antlered males. So yeah, so not only has it increased the survival rate of 1.5-year-old bucks, but there's also there's a lot of 2.5 and older bucks that don't get harvested, and I think that's mostly because hunters are out there and you have to count the points before you can pull the trigger, and that might be just enough time for those bucks to get away. But we've not only have seen, the younger bucks survive, but the older bucks are living older as well. So even on our study areas, that are current with the Deer-Forest Study, 4.5, 5.5-year-old deer is not unusual.
Mm-hmm.
For a male. That is.
Yeah. And do you see what, some areas it seems like that they grow bigger antlers than others. And does that, I'm sure a lot of that has to do with the nutrition and everything, but what have you learned from that within the studies? Have you been able to correlate anything?
Well, our study areas are, large tracts of contiguous forest, fairly poor soils. But I can say when we were doing the research on the effects of antler point restrictions and looking at antler sizes statewide, antler size is probably most strongly correlated with the general soil conditions. So our counties that have better soils have the larger deer. If you look at the factors that influence antler size, the first factor, age. So the older a buck gets, the bigger the antlers. The second factor is basically nutrition, and nutrition is driven primarily by the quality of the soil. And then after that, way down the list is genetics. People there's lots of talk about genetics, but I can tell you that that is way down the list.
Okay. That makes sense. Is there a place that you can find where the soils are better in certain counties, or however that would be split up?
Yeah, there are soil maps. The NRCS is a federal agency that handles a lot of the farm bill, and they're responsible for monitoring soils and crops. And there are soil maps for every single county in the country, and you could look at those soil maps to see soils that are higher in calcium and magnesium would be more productive sites. Okay.
From going back to when you were talking about radio collaring deer and learning from their movements, that you have some really cool videos put together, basically of all the points where the radio caller was sending the signal to you, and be able to put that in a map and show where the deer have been moving throughout the entire year, and then even more specifically in the hunting season, where those of us that are hunters really pay attention to. And so explains a little bit what you've learned by that. Are you seeing any sort of trends with their movements? Are they animal specific, or what are you seeing there?
Well, we have deer season start in October with archery and go through to mid-November, and then right after Thanksgiving, we have our rifle season, and then after Christmas, we have a late archery and muzzleloader. For the most part, the archery and the late seasons have very little effect on movements, as far as I can tell. But the rifle season, where we have 500,000 people pursuing white-tailed deer in the state over, a 12-day season, we're seeing you see huge changes in their behavior. Deer home ranges on our study areas that average about a square mile. During the rifle season, they average about 100 acres. So those deer really restrict their movements, and they also they found good hiding places. So between those two things, it makes it much more difficult for a hunter to encounter a deer because they move a lot less. It's not so much that they go nocturnal. They're still most active in the morning and the evening, but the fact that their movements are so reduced, there's less chance for interacting with a hunter. So that's sort of in the general. But then you look at movements of individual deer. A deer that survives because they found a place where they're not going to get disturbed. And, I tell people this is not deer thinking, oh, where can I go and not be disturbed by hunters? It's more like they got lucky. They were disturbed by hunters. They ran off and they ended up in a spot where they weren't bothered. And they remember that, and that's the spot they go back to. And so if you go on our website and the blog and look at some of those movies, you can see that these deer, they don't leave their home range. They go to some spot within their home range that for whatever reason, hunters are unlikely to go there. And usually those are spots high up on a ridge with a steep slopes, which obviously are very difficult to get to. And even if you can get to them, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to sneak up on a deer. And so those spots you can just watch over the 12 days of the rifle season. By 4 a.m, they run up to that spot, they lay down, they don't move until about 10 or 11 in the morning. Then you might start to see movements in the afternoon, and by late afternoon, they might be even back down by a road or something. And they just repeat that behavior every single day. So it's been, it's really interesting. I guess for me, being a hunter myself, I understand a little better why I don't see as many deer rifle season. I'm not sure it makes me feel any better, but at least I have an understanding why.
Yeah. Is there any, you're talking about, on the ridges and, some of those steep areas that are harder to get to. Do you notice anything like with vegetation as far as where they're going to? Are they going to, thicker spots or anything along those lines?
Well, unfortunately, that's the $1 million question that will take about $1 million to figure out. Because we don't have good maps of understory vegetation. I can tell you, the Bureau of Forestry has maps to say, well, this is, an oak stand that was cut, 20 years ago, or, this is a northern hardwood stand that was cut 50 years ago. But they don't have good data on well, whether this area is, thick with mountain laurel or this area is open with fern. So unfortunately, lots of people have asked me, so what is it like? What's the understory? And do they like this versus that? And I can't answer the question because I don't have the data.
Okay. I understand that. And so going back, okay, so outside of rifle season, and you're looking at, let's say, into October, what are you seeing as far as their movements, and as it gets into the rut, and specifically looking at bucks and their movement with what you've learned from tracking these deer?
Well, I've had some students looked at weather that influences movements, and essentially it has very little effect. So basically that means that just because it's raining out doesn't give you an excuse not to go hunt. We've also, unfortunately, the other thing we don't know is food. It'd be really nice to know, does this ridge have a good mass crop of white oak acorns, and is this area not have a lot of mast, and so I have not, and I cannot tie those movements to how deer are responding to food. The only other thing I can say is that by the end of October, probably 20 to 25% of females have been bred. So that last week in October, around the third week in October, the rut really starts to pick up. And then, of course, the rut peaks in the middle of November, around the 13th of November. By the 13th of November, half the females are pregnant by that time. So those movements during the rut, there's no pattern that I've been able to discern. Those bucks are just crisscrossing their home range. In fact, their home range doubling or even quadrupling in size, and they're just walking 24/7 back and forth across their home ranges, looking for females that are, in estrus. So yeah, it's kind of crazy to watch these guys go.
Yeah.
Like I said, I mean, they're in 20 to 30 days, they're covering, over 100 miles. They're basically walking 24 hours a day, just searching for mates.
Okay, and with those movements, do you see? I mean, I know you said they're kind of just going everywhere, but do you see, any specific, like they're following any terrain features or doing anything along those lines, different elevations?
Nope. So, although, I do have to say that in the past, during the rut, we've really only gotten locations every 3 hours. So, so like some of these guys are, in the course of 6 to 12 hours, they're covering, multiple miles. And so only getting a location every 3 hours doesn't give you a lot of detail about their exact path. This year, we programmed the callers to get a location every hour, so we should get a little more detailed picture of their movements during the rut. But basically, if you look at where a deer is every 3 hours, you really can't predict where he's going to be in the next 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Other than if he's on one edge of his home range, he's going to be turning around and heading for in another direction. But otherwise, there's at that interval, I've never been able to see any type of pattern to their movements.
Okay.
They're covering their home range during that 1 month averages about 2 square miles, and some of those bucks have home ranges that are 4 square miles. So I have no idea how and have no inkling on how you would go to predict their movements when they're covering that large of an area.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of that, a lot of the does where they would be bedded at, throughout the day might change based on the food year to year. I know this year in some of the areas I was hunting, the acorn crop on the tops of the hills was not very good, and it seemed like the acorns were damaged. And again, I don't have I don't know enough about it from a scientific side of things, but it seemed like they were almost rotted early on, and the deer were lower on as far as elevation went than they had been, in the past, as far as just a general, from being in the woods hunting a lot and trail cameras and different things like that, and that made it very tough to kind of figure that out.
Yeah, and in fact, the females, their behavior is the opposite of males during the rut. Their home ranges actually shrink, because if you're lost in the woods, what do they tell you? They tell you to stay put. And so, if the males are the ones running around looking for females, it's going to be easier to find a female if she doesn't move. And so, we actually see both males and females, like in September, would have a home range of about a square mile, and you'll actually see a decline in October and November in the female home range, and then of course the male home ranges just expand, like I said, 2 to 4 times.
Okay. And throughout your 3 different study areas, is there anything that were the movements or, some of the stuff that you found similar between those different places, or were there a lot of differences?
I can't say, our southern study areas are in the Ridge and Valley region, and the northern study areas are, in the Allegheny Plateau, and essentially are very similar movements. I really can't say that that there's any characteristic that's strikingly different between the 2 areas. Of course, all of our study areas are 95% forested, so they're similar in that respect.
So I read a recent blog post that you had put out here at the end of November that was titled "The Ultimate Guide to Hunting Big Woods Deer," and some of the things that you had there were interesting to me, and especially the ones that you had listed as far as what not to worry about, and in regards to deer not going nocturnal, and some of the other things there as far as where you titled the second one "Werewolves," where how deer don't howl at the full moon or any moon, to that matter. So I guess what you were saying there, as far as you're not seeing much of a difference whether it's a full moon or anything else.
Yeah, I actually had an undergraduate whose grandfather always told her that when it was a full moon, deer didn't move as much during the day. So she actually got our data and looked at that. Of course, she didn't have hourly data for bucks. She was just able to look at it with females. But statistically there was a difference, but the difference was so small. Like if it's a moonlit night, they might walk, 20 or 30 yards less than during a dark night. So yeah, there's not, from what we've seen with our deer, there's very little effect of the moon on their movements. I think the biggest thing is the fact that they just don't move as much. And so it almost seems like they go nocturnal. But if, I've written some blog posts and graphed some of that they, like I said earlier, their peak movements are in the morning and the evening. It's just that their overall movements are so much less that you're less likely to see deer moving.
Okay. And what about some of the other, common myths there? You were talking earlier about the weather and that not affecting the movement. And so that's something that, in my own mind, I've been trying to, figure out where, you always hear and I've always been told, colder weather affects deer movement. And, that's the best days to be out hunting. And what I've kind of thought about more, because I've been one of the ones that, that wants to hunt. If I can pick a couple days off during the rut to hunt, to get off work, I'm going to pick a colder day. And I always wondered if it would be the same on those other days that I wasn't hunting or similar. But it was just that I was putting all my eggs in the basket of the days that I, claimed the best.
Yeah, I really haven't been able to see any difference. Now, during the rut, the weather, there isn't anything that influences buck movements during the rut except females that are in estrus. They are just going 24/7. It doesn't matter with the moon, with the weather. Even extremely warm days, in October, late October, even early November, we can get several days that are in the high 60s or even 70s. And that's, if there's females that are in estrus in an area, those bucks are going to be moving and looking for them. I think, however, there is, I've got lots of data, and I'm looking at the averages, and what hunters are experiencing are just one small area, and so they might see, really reduced movements or not a lot of movement, 1 year, and then the next year they're going to see a lot of movement, and that's probably related more towards the variability in the number of females that are in estrus during that time period than it is related to any factor like weather or the moon or anything like that. We looked at the birth dates of fawns over about 7 years, and over those 7 years, there was essentially no variation in the average date that a fawn was born. The breeding on average occurs at the same time every year. But if you're hunting in one area, that could be different from 1 year to the next just because of, the females and their breeding status.
Okay. And another interesting topic that I've read about in your blog and watching some of the videos put together there is when deer kind of, and I think there was a specific one, I can't remember the number that you had assigned to it, but that would leave in its home range and go far away for no specific reason, and then that deer ended up dying in that place.
Yeah, that was a really strange one. Probably our most famous deer. Why he did that. So, 95% of the deer, their home range looks like just a blob on the landscape, right? It's just a circle or an oval or some shape like that. But we have documented a few deer both males and females that might shift their home range. There's one buck that we have for 2 or 3 years in a row. During the rut, he would move a couple of miles away, and that's where he would spend the breeding season. When the breeding season was done, he would go back to this other area. We had a female for several years in a row. We captured her in the wintertime on the state forest, and she traveled north and spent the whole summer where I'm sure she gave birth to her fawns in this farmland. And then at the end of the growing season, she would travel back to that same area on the state forest. And then again in the spring, she'd leave for the summer. And so we have a few examples of that, but that's really rare. And then this one buck that you were referring to was even more unusual movements in that we caught him, and he left, probably spent 12 hours. He left his home range, went to this spot to the northeast, and came right back to his home range. And for the next 2 years, he never went back there. And then we found that he must have gotten in a fight with another buck, and we think he was probably fatally injured in that event. And he left his home range and went to that spot, and that's where he died. Unfortunately, he died in the middle of an ice storm, and our crews could not get there for a couple of days, and the coyotes had, scavenged the carcass, so we couldn't determine the real cause of death. But we do have from movements right before he left his home range to go and die in that spot, that he was for several hours was right with another buck in that same area. So people have, speculated why he would go to that spot. We have no idea. I have no explanation whatsoever, but it's just one of those things, we've got radio collars around the neck. We know where these deer go, but we don't know why or how, they make those decisions. So that's just one of those mysteries, I think, that we won't be able to solve. We know what happened, but we don't know why.
Ah, that's interesting. That's one of the reasons I really enjoy, reading your studies and everything there, because it's so interesting what these deer do and being able to see the plotted movements and everything. Because, I've been able to hunt in a bunch of different places throughout the country and even in Canada, and I've never found a place that's like here in the big woods, mountainous regions of Pennsylvania, where the bucks and deer in general just act the way that they do.
Yeah, it's interesting, and like I said, this technology has given us an opportunity to look at animal movements in greater detail than we've ever been able to before. I could have told you, 20 years ago that a deer's home range was about a square mile. But beyond that, I really couldn't tell you a whole lot, because with the technology back then, I might get, 50 to 100 locations in a year, whereas, today I can get 50 locations in a day, and that makes a huge difference in understanding these deer movements.
So, Dwayne, what are you said that this Deer-Forest Study or the forest deer study is going to be a long-term thing to really be able to see the effects and everything. So are you going to continue kind of the same method going forward, or is there anything new as far as goals with it that as you're adapting and seeing different things? I guess what's the future state of the Deer-Forest Study?
Yeah, so we began in 2013, and we were initially funded for 4 years. And the Game Commission and the Bureau of Forestry continued that funding for another 3 or 4 years. So really, it's sort of, in a sense, it's kind of operational at this point. We capture deer in the wintertime. We go out and visit our vegetation plots with our field crews in the summer and collect vegetation and basically just monitoring the response, changes in deer numbers and changes in the vegetation conditions. And like I said, vegetation, especially under a canopy of a mature forest, changes very slowly. So it's going to take, when we started this project, we knew it would take at least 5, maybe 10 years before we would even start to begin to see changes in the vegetation. And basically that's what's happened.
Okay.
Unfortunately, vegetation, trees grow slowly, and the most important thing you can have available to you to study them is time.
Okay, that makes sense. So Dwayne, where, or do you have anything else that you would like to cover, or anything else from this standpoint and some of these topics that you would like to dive into?
I don't know. We've covered a lot here. Like I said, a lot of what we've shared with hunters and the public is really, what would you call it, incidental or serendipitous, because our objective for capturing and marking deer was really to get a handle on deer numbers but because of the technology that we have, it's really provided a lot of insights into deer behavior, especially in response to hunting. One of the things like I said earlier, is that the harvest rates on our study areas are fairly low. Bucks are in the range of 15 to 20%. And if you look statewide, it's probably closer to 40 to 60%, depending on the management unit. So these harvest rates on our study areas are really low, and as a result, in a lot of cases, we've had collars on deer for 3 years, and we've had to blow the collar off because the battery was about to fail, instead of it being harvested and recovered, by a hunter. And as a result, like I said, 4.5, 5.5-year-old bucks on our study areas in the big woods of Pennsylvania are no longer unusual.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting. So Dwayne, where can people find these studies at and everything else, if you wouldn't mind giving some of that information, so they can learn more and read the details of just the surface that we covered here today?
Right. So we have a website. If you go to ecosystems.psu.edu/deer, that website is where we have a blog, going back to 2014. And those blog posts cover a whole range of topics. I can't believe we've been writing it for that long, but we have. So ecosystems.psu.edu/deer.
Okay. Well, Dwayne, first of all, I'd like to, thank you again for coming on here and talking with me and to all the listeners here with, a majority of them coming from Pennsylvania and, in a lot of the surrounding areas that I think that, maybe in other areas of the Appalachian range can learn from these studies and gain some knowledge from it. So I appreciate it, and I'm subscribed to the blog. I'd recommend that everyone does that to be able to get the updates when they come through, because it is extremely helpful.
Yeah, that's a good point. I should have mentioned that if you go to our website, there's a place where you can click on and submit your email address, and then you'll get an email blast whenever we have a new blog post.
Yep, and I have the website actually pulled up here in front of me, and there's big blue letters there to subscribe to the Deer-Forest blog by email.
Yep.
So, all right, Dwayne. Well, I again appreciate you coming on here and everything, and I hope that you have a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and Happy New Year.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and share a little bit about the research project.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of East Meets West Hunt with your host, Bo Martonic. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit eastmeetswesthunt.com, Facebook at East Meets West Outdoors, and Instagram at East Meets West Hunt. If you enjoyed today's episode, please review and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.